So, namaskar friends and welcome once again. In the previous class, we were talking about ethics and its importance in our life. And we all understand that without ethics and moral, life will not be any better than animal existence. If we are humans and we call ourselves intellectually and rationally sound, it is because of such institutions that we have built. It is because of the conduct rules that we have framed, rather in the process of evolution we have realized how they are important to sustain life. So, in this particular lecture I intend to talk about ethics in personal and professional life. Many a time we think that ethics is to be followed in letters and under some kind of diktat. But in the previous class I discussed it and I said that let ethics be part of our general behavior, because ethics is not something that has to be followed if one is compelled to. Rather, it has to be a part and parcel of our character, our cognition, our thinking. So, we need to understand how ethics operates throughout the fabric of life, whether we talk about personal or we talk about professional life. So, it is not something that is desirable, it is something that must be practiced and followed, whether we are in the personal parlance or we are in professional life. So, we always see that it is invoked only in the moments of crisis, scandals, dilemmas or visible wrongdoing. There is a clamoring from all that some kind of ethical standard has to be maintained. Yet most of the human life is not lived in crisis, but in the ordinary, repetitive and unnoticed patterns of behavior. Is life only defined by crisis? Do we need to take a rearguard action only in anticipation or in the face of crisis? No. Most of the time the life is lived in ordinary, repetitive and unnoticed patterns of behavior. So, how we regulate them, how we embed ethics, how we practice ethics in these ordinary, mundane, repetitive and unnoticed patterns of behavior, that is also very crucial. So, it is within these everyday actions how one speaks, responds, ignores, prioritizes or delays that ethical life is actually formed. So, Indian thought does not always present ethics as dramatic decision making, rather it is embedded in daily conduct, in our achara, what we call achara. So, it is embedded in our achara, in our acharan, habit and relational behavior. Ethics here is not an abstract system imposed from above, but an immanent structure of living, shaping how individuals relate to others across personal and professional spaces. So, it is not a choice, it is something that is integral, a necessary condition of our living experience. So, this perspective challenges a dominant modern assumption that ethics begins where rules are violated. Mostly in institutions, friends, we start asking for ethical conduct only when somebody violates the rules or some corruption happens. But the thing is, why that corruption happens? If ethical conduct is practiced, no such corruption will ever take shape. Instead, it suggests that ethical failure often begins much earlier. So, our own system believes in prevention rather than cure. It wants us to behave ethically in almost all actions, reactions, responses decision making, relationships, etc. In a small acts of indifference, normalized insensitivity or habitual disengagement, the real ethical problem begins there, because there is some kind of violation of ethical conduct when we remain indifferent or when we normalize insensitivity, which quite often happens in our modern life. Somebody meets with an accident and we rationalize our indifference or insensitivity in the name of who will get into all this. The police will ask lot of questions. So, we form a habit of disengagement and we try to justify that ethically. So, our beginning of unethical conduct begins in such actions that are conveniently overlooked. So, this shifts the focus from big moral choices to micro level responsibility. Let us look at it. Ethics is embedded in all our relations, all our actions, all our decisions, all our choices, and that is why I said that it is not something that has to be invoked once the wrong has been committed or a rule has been violated. Why? It has to be practiced all the time. So, let us look at friendship. Friendship is often celebrated as unconditional loyalty. A friend in need is a friend indeed, but then what kind of need do we really ask? A robber going for robbery needs his gang members whom he thinks are his friends, but then they all indulge in something that is considered unethical conduct. So, of course, they help the robber in the accomplishment of this task, but whether that task is desirable, ethical or not. So, that question is also very important. The ideal that friendship is about unconditional loyalty itself is problematic. It becomes ethically dangerous. When loyalty is placed above truth, friendship risks turning into a space where wrongdoing is protected rather than challenged. So, a true friend is not one who always agrees with you, but one who is willing to disturb, confront and even risk the relationship for the sake of what is right. You might be aware of the line in Ramcharitmanas where Tulsidas ji says, Sachiv Bad Guru, if these three people out of fear or out of psychophancy do not speak the truth, then the Raj, Dharma and Tan, they are all destroyed. So, the relationship between Krishna and Arjun illustrates this tension powerfully. Arjun himself acknowledges Krishna not only as a guide and mentor, but also as a friend, Sakha, when he says, Sakheti matva prasabham yaduktam, thinking of you as my friend, whatever I have rashly said. So, he thinks Krishna as a friend. Now, loyalty means Krishna has to support him unconditionally, but Krishna does not do that. At the moment when Arjun withdraws from action in Kurukshetra, overwhelmed and morally confused, Krishna does not protect that friendship through comfort. Instead, he challenges him sharply and he says, Klabhyam ma asma gamah partha naitatvayup padyate. That means, yield not to weakness, O Arjuna, it does not befit you. So, there he chooses advice, although this advice might not suit the liking of Arjuna, over comforting him and just endorsing his idea. So, this is not gentle reassurance, in a way it is ethical provocation. Krishna risks emotional discomfort to restore clarity. Friendship here becomes a space of accountability, not indulgence. So, your true friends are those who stand by you, but who have courage to point out your mistakes as well, who have sincere desire to guide you. This raises an uncomfortable question for contemporary life. How often does friendship become a shelter for avoidance? We excuse harmful behavior as understanding, remain silent to preserve closeness, or choose validation over honesty. So, this often happens in our modern life, we keep secrets from our near and dear ones, and the friends, although they know that our behavior is wrong, we should be true in our relationships, should not hide such things from our parents or the near and dear ones, they still engage in that kind of complicity. So, in doing so, friendship subtly shifts from support to complicity. At the same time, truth itself is not ethically neutral. Truth delivered without care can become aggression. Now, all of us know that the relationships are always very delicate. So, even if we speak the truth, we need to understand how to deliver that truth, while care without truth becomes manipulation. So, we also have to deliver the truth very carefully. The ethical difficulty lies in holding both, to speak truth without breaking trust and to sustain trust without abandoning truth. So, the failure of friendship is not conflict, it is the refusal to risk conflict when it is ethically necessary. So, if we understand that ethics has to be an integral part of any friendship, in which a friend should be our real benefactor or real well wisher, and should also have moral courage to stand up against some of our wrongdoings when the moment arrives, then certainly we will believe that this kind of friendship is based on ethical considerations. Family is often idealized as the foundation of moral life, a space where values are nurtured and protected. No doubt, everything that we learn that becomes part of our behavior is shaped in our family. Yet, it is precisely within family that ethics is most frequently compromised without being recognized as compromise. Affection, loyalty, and emotional closeness can quietly transform into justification for partiality, making wrongdoing appear tolerable, forgivable, or even invisible. So, in family structure also we find, friends, that the ethical conduct is always compromised and the wrongdoing is justified, sometimes in the name of love, affection, or otherwise. You might be aware of many such examples where the parents cover up the wrongdoing of their children, and those children become hardened criminals later on, because they are ethically bankrupt. They have never been told that a particular kind of conduct is unethical. So, the relationship between Dhritarashtra and Duryodhan is one such example, where in the family the father and son do not follow ethical conduct. The relationship between Dhritarashtra and Duryodhan reveals this with unsettling clarity. Dhritarashtra is not unaware of his son's actions. His failure is not intellectual but ethical. He does not intervene where he should have been intervening. He does not tell his son that his conduct is unethical or dharmic. Rather, he protects him. He tries to justify each wrong committed by him. He sees, hesitates and ultimately chooses inaction, not because he does not know what is right, but because he is unable to act against his own attachment. So, friends, many a time because of such attachment we very comfortably make ethical compromises. This exposes a deeper ethical problem. Family relationships often operate within a moral exception. What would be condemned in public is rationalized in private. So, publicly everybody believes that the women should be given respect, should be liberated, should be given equal status, but then in the family they want to confine their women to household activities. Their conduct is different. So, such ethical mismatch is not good for any institution, be it family. In contemporary context, this logic persists in more subtler form. Nepotism justified as trust. Now, nepotism is a serious problem, all of us know, bhai bhatijawad, where the relatives, the sons and daughters are given preference. So, this is justified as trust. Lot of people will say that so and so come from political family that has some lineage, and that is why we have trust in them. But then we easily bypass the more worthy in favor of these people and certainly compromise on ethics. Favoritism is masked as care, silence in the face of wrongdoing framed as protection. Such practices do not appear as ethical failures because they are embedded within the language of love and belonging. They have been so naturalized that we hardly tend to feel that some kind of ethical compromise has been made. They produce long term distortions, not only in institutions, but in the moral formation of individuals. And that is why I said that all of us learn the behaviors in our own families, but then it depends what kind of behavior is taught to us through the moral fabric, through the ethical actions within our families. So, a family where moral compromise is a norm, we grow as an individual who always pass ethics without any kind of moral hitch. This challenge is a comforting assumption. Love does not automatically produce ethical clarity. In fact, without reflection, it can produce ethical blindness. Family ethics therefore requires something counterintuitive, the ability to maintain ethical distance within emotional proximity, to care without becoming complicit. So, loving each other in the family does not mean being blind to the ethical and moral lapses on the part of family members. Fine. So, if the family members are loved and at the same time reminded of their ethical conduct whenever they go against that, that will certainly help them better in their future life. Again, ethics in the teacher student relationship. Now, ethics is everywhere, in the personal parlance, in our friendship, in our family, in the professional world, starting from school, college to institutions and organizations. The most basic that we all experience is the relationship between a teacher and a student. In Indian tradition, it is often presented as a transformative bond, yet it is also a site of power, selection and ethical tension. Do we find that it maintains the ethics all the time? It is neither purely ideal nor entirely exploitative. Rather, it reveals how knowledge can both liberate and control depending on how it is mediated. On the one hand, the tradition offers deeply affirmative models. In the Upanishads, the dialogue between Yajnavalkya and Gargi shows a space where questioning is not suppressed, but encouraged. Gargi challenges the teacher publicly, and the exchange reflects an ethical pedagogy grounded in intellectual openness rather than authority. This is a very positive model. Similarly, the story of Satyakam Jabala. Satyakam Jabala was the disciple of Maharishi Gautam, and as the story goes, he approached him for teaching him, and the Maharshi asked his Gotra, to which he candidly admitted that he does not know his Gotra. He has lost his father, and the mother was too busy in her daily chores that she was not able to tell him who he really is and what his Gotra is. Maharshi is very happy with the candidness or frankness of Satyakama, and presuming that he may be a Brahmin boy, he is ready to guide him, and he guides him. So, the story of Satyakama Jabala demonstrates that access to knowledge is granted on the basis of truthfulness rather than lineage, suggesting a model where teaching resists social exclusion. These can be beautiful models, yet this ideal coexists with more troubling examples. But then we have other examples also that belie this kind of moral obligation and ethical conduct. The figure of Drona in the Mahabharata, we have earlier also talked about how he asks for the thumb of Eklavya. Well, so the figure of Drona in the Mahabharata reveals how pedagogy can become entangled with hierarchy and control. Just because Eklavya is likely to challenge his disciples from the royal lineage, he indulges in an act that is condemned by everybody and is ethically unbecoming of a teacher. This coexistence of openness and control suggests that the teacher student relationship is ethically unstable. It can either expand possibility or reproduce limitation. In contemporary educational institutions, this tension persists in subtler forms. Mentorship often depends on proximity to authority, opportunities are unevenly allocated, and institutional hierarchies quietly shape who is seen, supported or sidelined. So, fair opportunity is not given to everybody. This challenges the assumption that education is inherently ethical. The mere transmission of knowledge does not guarantee fairness. Teaching becomes ethical only when it actively resists its own tendency toward gatekeeping and bias, and instead works toward inclusion, dialogue and equitable access. So, education does not automatically liberate, dear friends, unless it questions who controls knowledge. It risks becoming a refined form of exclusion. So, when we talk about ethics in education, ethics warrants that all the people, irrespective of their background, their caste, their economic condition, should be granted access to knowledge. Again, respect in personal ethics, boundaries and maryādā, we call it maryādā. Boundary setting in a relationship appears selfish, rigid or even unloving. Indian ethical thought complicates this through the idea of maryādā, not merely as restraint, but as a structure that defines the limits of rightful conduct. It is not something that is considered limiting, rather it is considered liberating and ethical. However, this idea is not as stable as it appears. boundaries are not inherently ethical. They can protect dignity, but they can also reinforce hierarchy, exclusion or emotional distance. What is presented as Maryada can sometimes function as a mechanism of control. You might have experienced it. In the name of Maryada, the women of the household are not allowed access to outside world. They say that the threshold of the house should never be crossed by them. Now, there in the name of Maryada, we are indulging in unethical controlling of subjects, restricting expression, silencing dissent or maintaining unequal relationships under the language of propriety. At the same time, the absence of boundaries produces a different ethical problem. Well friends, we have to be liberal with our students, we have to make them feel comfortable in our company, we have to convince that we are accessible and they can approach us anytime, but does that mean there should be no maryada between us and our students? Should they come with any kind of talk with us? Should they cross their limits? It is a very delicate situation friends, but then some kind of boundary setting is always required. So, the absence of boundaries produces a different ethical problem. Relationships without limits often lead to emotional overreach, entitlement and subtle exploitation, where care becomes obligation and presence becomes expectation. So, in contemporary life this tension is visible in debates around consent, emotional labor and personal space. So, many a time we find that our voices are silenced in the name of boundary setting. Many a times we find that in the name of breaking boundaries or liberating ourselves, we cross the threshold, we cross the ethical boundaries as well. So, public institutions are built on the promise of collective welfare, yet they often operate through structures that make accountability difficult to locate and even harder to enforce. In institutions, how ethics operates? What is ethical? What is unethical? Authority is distributed across layers, committees, departments, hierarchies, creating a system where decisions are made collectively, but responsibility is rarely owned individually. And here comes the question of ethics. This produces a paradox: power is exercised with confidence, but accountability remains diffused and deferred. When it comes to claim credit for something, everybody is ready to claim credit, but if something goes wrong, they all pass the buck. Nobody is ready to take the blame. In contemporary public institutions, this structural problem becomes more visible. Decisions that affect large populations are often justified through procedure rather than responsibility. Harm, when it occurs, is explained through systemic failure rather than individual accountability. Process was followed, guidelines were met, yet outcomes remain ethically troubling. This is how people try to justify that. If there is an institutional failure, the head of the institution also has to take the responsibility, but it does not happen. The lesser known individuals or the lesser individuals in hierarchy are blamed and the responsibility is passed on them. The failure of a government system results in removal of some lesser officials, in their transfer, in their suspension, while the people who are responsible for these decisions, they are spared. If we talk about ethics in the private sector, that is in the public sector, where every effort is made that all decisions are taken collectively, but then responsibility is not shared, collectively, or no individual is held responsible for some kind of debacle. While this is mandated that the person who is in the real sense responsible for that failure should be made ethically accountable. In the private sector, it is often defended as a space of efficiency, innovation and growth. We always believe that private sector is a place for efficiency, innovation and growth. Yet these very strengths produce a deeper ethical tension. Profit becomes the primary metric, responsibility is forced to justify its relevance. Ethics is not absent, but it is frequently subordinated, negotiated or postponed in the face of financial targets. The problem is not that businesses pursue profit, it is that modern systems are structured to reward short term gains while diffusing long term consequences. When the sole motive turns out to be profit, by whatever means the profit is made is welcome, to the utter neglect of the process of profit making, to looking at it as an ethical practice, well, the problem arises. Decisions that generate immediate value, cost cutting, aggressive expansion, data extraction, labor minimization, they are incentivized. In such environments, compliance often replaces conscience. As long as actions fall within legal boundaries, they are treated as acceptable. But legality and ethics do not always align. What is permissible within law may still produce social inequality, environmental damage or human exploitation. So, education today increasingly operates as a system of credential production rather than intellectual formation. Degrees, grades and placements become the primary indicators of success, while the slower, less measurable processes of thinking, questioning and ethical reflection are pushed to the margins. When institutions are evaluated through rankings, outputs, employability metrics, they begin to optimize for performance rather than understanding. What we tend to value is the visible outcome to the utter neglect of the processes that might lead to more sustaining outcomes. This shift produces a subtle but pervasive ethical distortion. Students are not simply learning, they are strategizing how to score, how to perform, how to meet expectations with minimum risk. In such an environment, practices like plagiarism, ghostwriting and superficial research do not appear as isolated moral failures, they become systemically encouraged behaviors normalized by pressure to produce outcomes quickly. And obviously, this calls for an ethical reconfiguration. Integrity under pressure between personal and professional ethics. There may be situations where your personal ethics comes in conflict with the professional ethics. What do we do? The conflict between personal values and professional expectations is often framed as a temporary dilemma, but in reality it is a structural feature of modern life. We often come across this kind of a dilemma. Organizations operate through goals, targets and hierarchies that demand alignment, while individuals carry moral institutions that may not always fit within these frameworks. The result is not occasional tension, but a persistent condition of ethical negotiation. More often than not, individuals do not openly resist unethical demands. Instead, they gradually adjust their moral thresholds. So, this ethical normalization that takes place in the name of institutional balance and institutional discipline is certainly something that is troubling. Small compromises are rationalized as necessary, temporary or harmless, and over time this produces a form of ethical desensitization, where what once felt uncomfortable becomes routine. Professional environments further complicate this by rewarding compliance and penalizing dissent. Speaking up may carry risks, loss of opportunity, isolation or career stagnation. As a result, silence becomes a strategy and conformity appears rational. So, your individual morality and ethics takes a back seat and you learn to make ethical compromises in the name of visible outcomes. So, what is the core challenge in maintaining integrity across domains? Modern life encourages a quiet fragmentation of the self. Individuals are expected to operate differently across contexts, empathetic in personal relationships, competitive in professional spaces, compliant within institutions. This produces a convenient ethical arrangement. One can be good in one domain while suspending that goodness in another without feeling contradictory. Integrity in this sense becomes a matter of selective performance rather than a unified orientation. Professional environments reward efficiency over reflection, outcomes over values. Personal spaces prioritize harmony over confrontation. As a result, individuals learn in compartmentalized ethics, treating it as context dependent rather than foundational. So, they do not cultivate it in whatever they do, rather they implement it selectively based on the requirement. Indian ethical thought in contrast gestures towards an integrated self where action across domains reflects some degree of coherence. It is not that you are an efficient worker at workplace and at home you do not pay any attention to your duties. But this ideal is difficult to sustain in systems that actively reward inconsistency. The demand for integration therefore is not merely moral, it is counter structural as well. The danger of fragmentation is not only hypocrisy, because you act in a certain manner in one parlance, but act contrary to that in another one. It is also ethical numbness. When different standards are applied in different contexts, the ability to recognize contradiction itself begins to weaken. One no longer experiences tension, only adjustment. Integrity cannot be understood as a stable personal quality. It is a continuous effortful alignment repeatedly tested by environments that benefit from its erosion. So, ethics in IKS operates across personal and professional domains, adapting to different relationships while maintaining core principles of responsibility and awareness. In contemporary life, where complexity and uncertainty are constant, such an approach offers a way to navigate ethical challenges without reducing them to simplistic rules. So, ethics is not defined by what one believes, but by how one engages with others, power and responsibility in real situation. So, ethics is not something that has to be practiced selectively, but ethics is something that has to be embedded in whatever we do, whether it is personal or professional. So, thank you very much for your kind attention, friends. We will continue our discussion in the next class. Do join me. Thank you.